Why is crime in America so high? Does high crime in America have to do with America's high gun ownership? What policy can fix the crime problem in America? Let's take a look at the policies that would fix the crime problem in many cities in America. Number 1. The first step to combating crime is to increase the number of police officers and police resources. Logically, you can only combat crime if you have enough officers to do so, and laws against crime are only as real as the city's ability to enforce them using police resources. In 2020 and 2021, we saw many cities across America embrace the idea of defund the police. This idea led to massive spikes in the crime rate, because criminals were able to do whatever they wanted. Another important note is crime is likely far higher than crime statistics would ever show. Crime statistics only show known crime. They can never show crime that is never reported because no one ever called the police, or crime that happened on such a large scale that police were not able to categorize it and arrest the criminals, such as when mass riots happened. This phenomenon happened greatly in 2020 and 2021, when countless stores were looted on a large scale by the local community, causing $2 billion worth of property damage or more. In this way, crime statistics can only show us the minimum amount of crime, whereas in reality the total amount of theft, for example, is likely much higher than can be tracked by statistics. This is why violent crime, like murder, is often a measure of crime, because a body is an easy marker that murder has occurred and is likely to be an accurate statistic. Lack of police enforcement also leads to negative economic effects. Whenever theft is high in an area, important businesses such as Walmart are forced to close. When these stable businesses close, the entire area's economic opportunity drops for both employees and consumers. This effect then leads to the area being heavy in poverty, which can potentially lead to more crime. This creates a never-ending cycle of self-inflicted poverty based on regional crime. Number 2. Another key problem in crime enforcement is when laws are changed in a way that reclassifies what a crime is. This method can be used to artificially distort crime statistics and create the appearance of more safety. For example, in 2021, San Francisco and other places in California refused to prosecute theft under $950. This effectively legalized crime. This method of decriminalization of crime has happened in many cities in America and had led to crime statistics being wildly undercounted and underreported. Police officers are unable to do anything for citizens when they are called to a scene, and police officers do not even try to do anything for citizens because they know there is nothing they can do. Number 3. District attorneys must prosecute crime. District attorneys in certain cities in America, such as New York City, Minneapolis, and San Francisco, are infamous for their refusal to prosecute crime. These DAs will refuse to prosecute all kinds of crime, including violent crime. That means that thieves and murderers were painstakingly arrested by police officers who put their lives on the line arresting dangerous individuals, and the district attorney then lets out these individuals with a slap on the wrist, and they are on the street within days or weeks. This obviously distorts crime statistics, allowing politicians to claim that their soft on crime policies led to a decrease in criminal activity. What are the reasons for this behavior? In the view of these district attorneys, they often see it as unjust that certain communities in America go to jail more often than other communities in America. In their view, by letting these convicted felons go free, they are correcting America's history of historic injustice. This incentive system makes police officers refuse to attempt to arrest suspects because they know that in a matter of hours or days the district attorney will let these serious criminals out again, and the criminal will return to the behavior they were doing when they were first arrested. This essentially makes police officers powerless to do their jobs. This phenomenon is very present in cities like New York City, where prosecutors purposefully let out violent criminals immediately after they have been arrested. These criminals often go on to murder and rob the citizens of New York City. Number 4. Crime must be punished strongly, and repeat offenders must stay locked up. Often in the debate about criminal justice, many people will claim that criminals are unfairly overpunished for their crimes across America. This is false. If anything, in recent years America has given slaps on the wrist and let criminals out with virtually no real punishment or pushback. Criminals are rational actors. They respond to risk, reward, and incentives. When criminals are aware of the fact that they will not be punished hardly at all for major crimes such as brazen theft, grand theft auto, reckless driving, or even assault and murder, they will do more of it. It is not uncommon to hear of a criminal who has been arrested multiple or even dozens of times for serious crimes, yet continues to be let free to do the exact same crimes over and over again. This is in response to the incentive system in place that allows this sort of behavior. Repeat offenders are the biggest cause of crime. For example, it would not be far from reality to estimate that only 10% of the criminal population commits upwards of 90% of the crime. These criminals commit almost all of the crime, and many of them have been arrested dozens of times. It is not uncommon for criminals to have been arrested 5, 10, 20, or 30 times for serious crimes, and yet they still are on the streets and commit more crimes. A policy which stopped giving chances after their third or fourth offense, and instead deemed these criminals as beyond recovery, would likely solve the repeat offender problem. This is why it is important to view criminals as what they are. Criminals are evil individuals. There is no excuse for their actions. These are individuals who rob and murder others. They are not victims of circumstance. They do not deserve sympathy. They do not deserve to have rights. You should have sympathy for law-abiding citizens. You should care about the rights of the 99% of productive citizens and the ability of their families to walk safely through the city without being robbed, assaulted, or murdered. It is likely accurate to say that the vast majority of criminals cannot be reformed. They will always be a threat to the public, and for that reason, they should be kept in jail for as long as possible. Criminal justice reform focused on rehabilitation of criminals is very often flawed, because very often it attempts to let serious criminals free all under the guise of compassion, which inevitably leads to more citizens being harmed by these violent criminals. Many men are just evil individuals. They cannot be helped or reformed. It is an invasion of the rights of law-abiding citizens to tolerate criminal behavior, and law-abiding citizens are the people who should receive the most compassion, not criminals. Another aspect of law enforcement and justice in a court of law is bail. Bail is the amount of money defendants must pose to be released from custody until their trial. The purpose of bail is simply to ensure that defendants will appear for trial and all pre-trial hearings for which they must be present. Bail is returned to defendants when their trial is over. Often, judges in more progressive areas will set bail very low. When the bail is set to $0 or a low amount like $1,000, this essentially lets serious criminals have no incentive to return to court to accept their sentencing. Instead, they are able to roam freely with no consequences. Modern progressive reformers would seek to make the bail be essentially non-existent because they view that as mean to poor people. For obvious reasons, this sort of no punishment and no incentives for good behavior system is a system in which criminals are always treated very nicely, despite the fact that they are incentivized to continue terrorizing the local community with their repeated crimes. For serious offenders and felony charges, it would be safer for everyone if the bail was set to a high and reasonable amount, so that the alleged criminal cannot roam freely with no incentive for him to actually return to court. Methods such as bail or ankle monitors are effective incentivizing tools for preventing potentially convicted criminals from acting badly. States that do not have these measures in place defend the criminals' rights and treat them as nicely as possible, while having no respect for the 99% of law-abiding citizens who are victims of these serious criminals. Number 5. Strong punishment for everyday petty crime. One of the most efficient ways to prevent crime is to have very little tolerance for everyday petty criminal behavior and behavior that disturbs the public. By having no tolerance for even petty levels of public disorder, you prevent criminals from gradually ascending their levels of criminality from petty crime to violent crime. For example, in New York City in the 1990s, harsh on crime Mayor Rudy Giuliani drastically dropped New York City's crime rates. One of the methods he did this with was being harsh on petty nuisance behavior, such as people forcibly washing the windshields of people's cars as they drove around the city. This sort of nuisance impolite behavior shows criminals they can gradually do more and more crime and harass the populace because it seems to be tolerated. Even today, you can see this sort of effect on the New York City subway. Violent homeless people are allowed to walk around trains harassing the populace, many of which are women and children of all racial backgrounds, and cause them to fear for their life, because any of these loud and aggressive individuals could snap at any moment and start assaulting anyone who dared look at them the wrong way. This is why it is important to never tolerate even petty lawless behavior. As always, law-abiding polite citizens deserve more sympathy than violent criminals. This phenomenon is commonly referred to as the broken windows theory. The broken windows theory is a criminology theory that suggests that visible signs of disorder and crime in an environment can lead to more disorder and crime. Tolerance for small crime can set a precedent that the police do not take crime seriously. Why does America have such high crime rates? Would banning all guns in the USA stop crime and violence? Would common sense gun regulation fix the gun crime? Often in the gun control debate, the debate is framed to be a debate about morality. Those in favor of gun rights are seen as morally incorrect because they would rather protect gun rights than to see less people die by the hands of firearms. This analysis is false. The policy of pro-gun rights can be seen to be the better policy for preventing crime and violence, whereas the policy of banning guns or hindering gun rights can be shown to be a policy based on poor logic and poor understanding of statistics. There are a few key points in the debate about gun rights and gun control. Number 1. The Second Amendment is a protection of individuals' rights to own a firearm to resist government tyranny and firearms to protect their life and their property. The Second Amendment does not exist to protect hunting rights. The Second Amendment was created after the American Revolution and gives the people the right to arm themselves against government tyranny. In 2020, Canada started with a simple gun buyback. Then, in the span of just a few years, the government completely outlawed sales of new handguns in 2022. This is an easy example about how gun control and gun rights are a slippery slope, because many gun control advocates desire to have the wholesale banning of firearms, not just simple regulations. The creators of the Constitution were very serious about the rights of their citizens and the protection of those rights. Also, the Second Amendment applies to modern firearms, the same way that the First Amendment applies to free speech on the internet. The principle is the same. Number 2. Guns are a tool to commit crimes. Guns themselves do not commit crimes. Criminals commit crime. Often, politicians will try to crack down on guns simply for the fact that they are the tool used to commit a crime. In fact, in the United Kingdom, there have been restrictions on knife sales because knife crime by criminal youth is so prevalent. In this way, we can see how attempted crackdowns on the tools of criminals, such as guns or even knives, is a flimsy attempt at fixing the situation. We would not try to ban knives because they are used in crimes, and we would not try to ban cars if they were used in crimes, or try to ban cars because car crashes exist. This says nothing about the fact that criminals can, and do, use any weapon available to them, which can include guns, knives, cars, axes, hammers, and even their own fists in a fistfight during a robbery. Having a firearm is just a more efficient tool, but it does not hardly change the basic fact of the situation of criminality and violence. In this way, we can see that the focus should always be on protecting the ability of the 99% of law-abiding citizens who do not commit crimes, while finding ways to prevent criminals from committing violent crime. Although it is never talked about in mainstream news, guns are actually a key preventer of crime and improve the safety of those who own them. As mentioned, guns are just a tool, and the 99% of law-abiding citizens use guns to protect themselves and others far more times than they are ever used for crime. Number 3. The existence of more guns does not lead to more crime. Mainstream media places the blames of violence in America solely on the fact that guns are allowed to exist. Is there truth to this analysis? If the idea that guns are the reason crime exists were true, we would expect there to be a direct one-to-one correlation between gun ownership and crime. This cause and effect relationship does not exist. In fact, from 1996 to 2017, we can see that gun ownership skyrocketed, while crime overall plummeted in the same period of years. As expected, the analysis that more guns equals more crime entirely ignores the basic facts of the situation when it comes to crime and gun crime. There must be an understanding about the statistics regarding crime generally and gun crime. The idea that more gun ownership leads to more gun homicide is false. This claim essentially is a non-starter because it never takes into account the mentality of the gun owners. It is not hard to imagine that certain sets of gun owners may be 100% law-abiding and focused on their own safety and safety of others, while another set of gun owners may be criminals who wish to use their guns for crime. As always, guns are just a tool, and cultural attitudes about guns and crime are clearly the causal factor. For example, this is why crime rates among the European population, or even the Japanese population, is so low. These people and cultures simply do not commit many crimes in general, which can be seen as a result of cultural attitudes and strength of the social fabric. A key factor in gun death statistics is homicide and self-elimination. When looking at statistics, we must separate these factors because they are not the same phenomenon, with the same inherent moral and philosophical causes and effects. When strictly looking at gun homicide, we can see a different picture from the claim that more guns leads to more gun homicides. In summary, the claim of more guns leads to more gun deaths is lacking key context and is false. The mainstream media does not present the statistics accurately. Number 4. Guns are the best method to protect yourself and your property against criminals. The police can be 30 minutes away, and during the event of a violent crime, seconds matter. Citizens cannot rely solely on the government to provide their personal protection. The police can be 30 minutes away at any given moment, and a tool like a firearm is the best way for law-abiding citizens to protect themselves and maintain order. A primary factor for preventing crime is criminals being afraid of their victims. Criminals are often on record talking about how they purposefully avoid difficult and risky targets, people who they believe will have a firearm that can be used against their criminal behavior. Criminals are rational actors, and they respond to the risk and reward of the crimes they are committing. Carrying firearms is a key deterrent. In a world where criminals can form groups as large as 5 to 10 people, who they themselves may have anywhere from the power of their own fists, to the power of knives, to the power of fully automatic guns bought on the black market, we can easily see that disarming law-abiding citizens does nothing but allow more crime to go unopposed. Number 5. Laws against gun violence do not prevent gun violence or the acquiring of firearms by criminals. This is a simple point. Laws cannot stop criminals who do not obey laws. If anything, they may only slightly hinder the success of criminals, at the cost of massively infringing on the ability and rights of law-abiding citizens to successfully acquire a weapon to protect themselves. Even in countries where guns are virtually outlawed in their borders, it is not uncommon to hear stories about the fact that the only people who have guns are the criminal gangs. For obvious reasons, this is because criminal gang members do not follow the law and acquire their firearms on the black market if they cannot legally acquire a firearm. As expected, this essentially leaves the average citizen at the mercy of criminal gangs. Number 6. Good guys with guns must protect people from violent criminals who use a range of tools for violence. Although often mocked by the mainstream media, the phrase good guy with guns actually is a true phenomenon. Gun control advocates strawman the idea of good guys with guns and portray them as people who will accidentally cause harm to others and not be effective in preventing criminals, but this is just a strawman. In reality, good guys with guns can easily be shown to be an important phenomenon that exists in the real world to protect lives and property. In fact, the most obvious example of good guys with guns is police officers themselves. When it comes to gun ownership, it is easy to understand why extending the ownership of weapons for self-protection is a principle that leads to less crime. According to a gun ban point of view, there should be little to no examples of how firearm ownership improves safety overall and prevents crime. As we will see, the statistics do not support this idea. According to statistics, good guys with guns likely save just as many lives, if not more lives, than criminals ever take with guns. It is not easy to know how many lives guns have saved, because it likely isn't collected rigorously by law enforcement, whereas gun crime data is presumably always recorded accurately. In 2022, guns took approximately 50,000 lives, with 20,000 of those being homicide, usually caused by gang violence regarding the drug trade, and the remaining 30,000 deaths being cases of self-elimination. The CDC in 2020 referenced a study that anywhere from 60,000 to 2.5 million encounters are made safe by defensive gun use, meaning a gun was used to deter a threat or directly engage with a threat. Using this data, we can see that it is not unlikely that guns save anywhere from 60,000 lives to millions of lives, or at least prevented common crimes like theft. With this in mind, we can see on a statistical basis that guns are a net positive on society, based on the numbers alone. Similarly, car crashes cause about 30,000 deaths per year, which is even more than the number of gun homicides every year. But we do not see that as a right that must be taken away. Instead, we look for policy to make the incidence of car crashes less likely to happen. An important note about regulation is that while regulations in the realm of car safety may lead to less death in car crashes, more regulation regarding guns would do nothing but make firearm use more difficult or ineffective, for example by limiting the magazine size of an AR-15 to just 10 bullets. In this way, regulating guns is not productive in the same way regulating car safety is, and the focus should always be on the criminals and not the weapons. Regarding statistics about lives saved by guns, it would be very difficult to know just how many lives are saved by guns, because it is entirely possible that most incidents of self-defense may never be reported. Regardless, the idea that law-abiding citizens would protect themselves with their lawful firearms is very logical. In general, a society with well-trained gun owners is a polite society. What about gun-free zones, which attempt to reduce the carrying of firearms? Gun-free zones are a misguided concept. Criminals actively seek gun-free zones. They seek public spaces where crowds of people exist and do not have any protection. The most obvious and important example of this is schools which do not have security or security policies. The law-abiding citizen who is responsible with their concealed carry firearm is going to respect the gun-free zone, whereas the criminal who does not respect gun laws or gun-free zone laws is going to break the rule of the gun-free zone. Any place where there is mass crowds of people, there must be people who are armed and responsible for protecting them. Usually, this involves having a police officer at an event like a stadium concert. In the case of schools, some schools have no security guards whatsoever, which is logically why violent criminals are able to go unopposed. In this instance, the problem was not that guns, or more generally weapons of any kind existed, but obviously that a large group of people have no armed security to protect them, usually in the form of police officers. We can even see this logic apply to instances where criminals use their vehicle to harm crowds of people at events. In this manner, you can see how you must have measures to protect against such attacks, such as road barriers that are resistant to vehicles, and that the solution was not to attempt to ban cars from the road. Attempting to ban gun sales doesn't actually fix the problem, and it still leaves the crowds of people unprotected, while disarming virtually no criminals. What about places that have no armed police officers? There are many cases where a single concealed carrier has stopped a mass shooter from killing people, but these stories are never reported on the news. Number 7. Politicians who advocate for gun control and gun bans always have armed security. Another key note is that there is a great irony about gun control, relating to the politicians who push it. The irony of anti-gun politicians is that they always have armed security as they travel, and often live in private gated neighborhoods with armed security. While politicians themselves are protected by armed guards, they attempt to leave the general populace, some of which live in dangerous high-crime areas, with no means to protect themselves. These politicians attempt to force the general populace to bring a knife to a gun fight, which is even more ironic, because the gun used by the criminal is likely to be an illegally obtained firearm. Number 8. Criminals often use illegal firearms, which they purchase from the black market, and firearms which they stole from others. In the gun control debate, the main focus is always the AR-15 rifle. This is a semi-automatic rifle that is very reliable, and allows the user to have a standard capacity magazine of 30 rounds, which is useful for a self-defense situation. In reality, the primary method of firearm violence is using handguns. Handguns are useful because they are cheaper to acquire, and are easy for a criminal to conceal as they move about. Often stolen handguns are used in crime. In this manner, a gun control advocate would have to attempt to ban not only rifles, but also all handguns, which effectively outlaws gun ownership, if they actually desire to end gun violence. For obvious reasons, while banning rifles like the AR-15 has some popularity in the mainstream, banning handguns would get virtually zero support. As always, gun laws that make purchasing firearms more difficult primarily disarm legal gun users, while criminals do whatever they desire. Number 9. Firearms are the best method of self-protection, especially for vulnerable individuals like women. Another key beneficiary of gun protection is women. Most violent criminals are men, and women are not able to defend themselves against most men. This is why guns are the great equalizer for women. It offers a very easy tool to defend themselves, especially in cities. It is not difficult to find videos of criminals, composed of teams of anywhere from 3 to 5 people, invading the homes of people using fully automatic guns like the AK-47, which they likely obtained illegally. In these home invasion situations, the homeowner would stand no chance using a common handgun with a magazine that holds 7 bullets. The best chance the homeowner would have against this home invasion would be to have a capable rifle, such as an AR-15, with a magazine of at least 30 rounds. Attempts at gun control which limit the ability to acquire an AR-15, and attempts to ban normal-sized magazines and force use of a maximum of a 10-bullet magazine, only endanger the lives of the people who use these capable rifles for home defense. A government which forces its citizens to bring a knife to a gunfight puts their citizens in danger. Number 10. The mainstream media claims that children are most affected by gun violence, but this is false. Often statistics about children from ages 1 to 19 are used to present a picture that guns must be banned in order to save the children. While the desire to protect children is not wrong, the analysis of the situation by mainstream media pundits is completely incorrect. Firstly, in the age group of 1 to 19, children are likely to be harmed by car crashes about the same as gun violence. Harm by guns is not a significant factor when analyzed in context. Secondly, the primary reason gun violence exists in this age range is because of gang violence. Teens, even as early as the age of 15, begin getting involved in criminal and drug activity. For this reason, it should be obvious that teens who get involved in gang activity will represent virtually all of the gun deaths in this category. Thirdly, the age range of these statistics is often ages 1 to ages 19. We can see that including the ages 18 and 19, who are legal adults, can greatly change the skew of entire dataset, and that this dataset does not truly represent children in the way it is presented. As expected, the guns were not the cause of criminality, but rather the criminal behavior and gang activity of adults. And as mentioned previously, in order to protect schools for when events of violence do happen, the primary method is to actually have schools have armed security and security policies. Number 11. Gun crime and violent crime varies greatly by group. The idea that more gun ownership leads to more crime is very popular, but this analysis is proven wrong by the fact that gun crime varies wildly by group. It should be noted that while the focus of gun violence is always on guns, this analysis misses key causes. According to statistics, violent crime rates and crime rates in general vary greatly in general. In fact, Asian Americans have a population of about 20 million, yet commit virtually no crime. Attempts to focus on banning guns are superficial attempts to fixing the problem of gun violence, and are more likely an easy way for politicians to appear like they have fixed the problem of gun violence. This phenomenon exists in Europe. The European population in general does not commit as many crimes as the United States, because there are simply less people who desire to harm others. In this manner, comparisons between the US and European nations, and comparing their gun ownership rate, are often superficial and ignore key causes. Number 12. Other countries still have crime and violent crime, even when guns are illegal. Guns are not the only tool used by criminals, and banning guns would not at all prevent crime. The United Kingdom is infamous for brazen broad daylight knife crime and killing. In fact, if a murderer was dedicated, they could use knives, cars, hammers, and even pillows if they so desired. Crime should be illegal, not guns. Outside the US, the European nations are held in high regard for the fact that their nations do not have mass shootings as much as the United States do, and the reason for this is the fact that Americans have guns. This analysis is false and misguided. Firstly, the United States has nearly 10 times the population of many European countries. These European nations often have a very homogeneous population that in general does not commit many crimes, whereas the United States has a very diverse population which commits many crimes. The only factor relevant to the fact that the US has more mass killings is the fact that the US has more people who desire to kill others. There is simply more deranged people and criminals in the US who desire to harm others. Comparing the US to European nations, and then claiming that guns are the reason that crime is higher, is an extremely false analysis, because gun violence varies among groups in the US. As always, the cause is culture and desire to do crime, not the fact that more guns exists. Gun control advocates will use the fact the US has more guns as a surface-level explanation for the fact that all guns should be banned, but this is simply a correlation, not the true causation. The US also has the unhealthiest population and some of the highest drug use rates, whether prescribed by a doctor or drugs done illegally, which most certainly makes the US population have worse mental health in many cases, leading to more criminality. For all of these reasons, the cause is clearly not the fact that firearms exist. If there was a direct one-to-one relationship between gun ownership and more crime, the crime rate in America would be much higher. Second, in European nations where guns are not allowed, violent crime still exists. Even when the government is successful in removing almost all guns from the country's borders, crime still exists and can make cities very dangerous. The United Kingdom is infamous for its knife crime and machete crime, often happening in broad daylight. In this regard, we can see how a gun is just a tool, and banning guns does not ban criminality. Number 13. Most mass shootings are a rare occurrence statistically, and usually involve gang violence. Random mass shootings are usually in gun-free zones. What about mass shootings, often talked about when discussing banning the AR-15? Although this topic is the primary argument for banning guns, or more gun control, this argument lacks key context and statistics. Firstly, a mass shooting is defined as a person killing 4 or more people. This statistic does not just include random killings, but also everyday crime events such as gang violence. This fact alone alters the data about mass shootings. Overall, mass killings are a relatively rare phenomenon and do not constitute the vast majority of homicides. Secondly, most mass killings involve use of a handgun, rather than a rifle like the AR-15. As covered previously, most homicide in this manner is using a handgun when involved in gang activity. By attempting to ban weapons like the AR-15, which is one of the most popular home defense tools, you do not actually prevent the problem from occurring, while simultaneously disarming law-abiding Americans. Thirdly, a notable amount of mass shootings, or perhaps even a majority of them, occur in a gun-free zone. As covered previously, criminals are rational actors, and a gun-free zone is a logical place for criminals to reign unopposed. we can see that a policy of disarming citizens, or especially a lack of protection of crowds of people, is a very counterproductive policy that leaves no one except the criminals armed. In summary, the debate about mass shootings usually lacks key context and is used as the #1 argument for banning guns. Most mass shootings are simply generic gang violence. But when it comes to true random mass killings, simple points about protecting crowds apply. Places such as schools, businesses, and events like stadium concerts all require that there be armed security such as police officers to protect the crowds of people. Regardless of the weapon used in these instances, whether it be a rifle or a handgun or even a vehicle, the cause of the problem is that crowds of people are unarmed and not protected by police officers or armed staff. In this regard, we can see that banning gun ownership is not the actual solution to this specific problem, and this argument for banning guns or limiting gun rights is a misguided analysis. Number 14. Gun control and gun bans generally do not lead to decreased homicide. What about the idea of common sense gun control? Shouldn't we have reasonable regulation around guns? Would people for more gun rights be putting lives at stake? The viewpoint of common sense gun control saving lives from gun violence is false. This viewpoint essentially argues that the more gun bans there are, or the more stringent the regulation on guns to make them less deadly, the less gun violence there will be. Firstly, we should expect to see a direct one-to-one causation of more gun control leading to less gun homicide. This causation generally does not exist, because as covered previously, the existence of guns does not indicate there will be more violence committed by criminals, because the problem of gun violence is a problem of criminality, not the existence of guns. According to different examples of gun control laws going into effect, we can often see that gun control, and even outright gun bans, do not lead to the prevention of virtually any gun homicide. Secondly, all guns are lethal and dangerous. No amount of gun control will ever prevent a handgun from having lethal power. Even when the weapon used is a relatively simple tool, such as a common handgun, we still see that the vast majority of gun homicides and mass shootings are committed using handguns, and often in gang-related violence. Third, criminals are not affected by gun laws and regulation. As always, a criminal can easily acquire any kind of weapon off the black market. Even if all gun sales in America were banned entirely, the gun homicide rate would likely stay the same. Or, if all guns in America no longer existed, the problem of violence would still exist with other tools used by criminals, such as knives and other blunt objects. Fourth, general safety regulations, such as background checks, already exist for every gun sale in America. Even if a person legally acquires a firearm and uses it to commit crime, you cannot know if a person with a clean record would use the tool of a firearm for evil purposes. There is no way to predict or prevent crime from happening if the suspect can already pass a background check. For all of these reasons, we can see that there is no such thing as common sense gun control. This premise assumes that guns existing leads to more crime, which is false. Even the most simple gun, like a common handgun, is a deadly tool, the same way that a simple object such as a rock is a deadly tool. Our solution to rock violence cannot be attempts to ban assault rocks. Generally, the idea of gun control does nothing but disarm law-abiding citizens 99% of the time. You cannot ban or regulate violence or criminality. In summary, more gun laws and regulations are unconstitutional and would not reduce crime essentially at all. In fact, more regulation of guns and attempts to ban guns would likely disarm the 99% of law-abiding citizens and lead to more death and crime among the law-abiding population. What about the fact that overall crime dropped from the period of 2021 to 2022? Doesn't that show that America is getting safer? While it's true that America is safer than ever, especially from periods of peak crime such as the 1980s and 1990s, the idea that crime in the years 2020 to 2024 is very low is not strictly true and is missing key context. It is entirely possible that crime statistics are vastly underreported. Crime statistics only show crimes in which the suspect was arrested and convicted. This means there are a few factors which would lower the alleged crime rate. Number 1. People must report crime. For example, petty crime, such as theft. If populations in certain areas are reluctant to interact with police, or if people know that the police officer will not be able to do anything about the crime because crime is not punished by the district attorney in the local area, then they will not be reporting crimes to police. In the 2020 George Floyd riots and after, entire city blocks were looted and burned down. In this regard, the justice system likely never prosecuted the vast majority of the offenders, despite the fact that there was $2 billion worth of property damage and countless thousands of people looted stores like Walmart across the nation. The vast majority of these people will never be punished for these serious crimes. Number 2. If crime has been de facto legalized, or crimes like theft have been reclassified from serious charges to minor charges, then the crime rates for certain crimes will appear low. This happens in Democrat states such as California and New York. Number 3. If district attorneys do not prosecute crime because they view it as a mean thing to do, or they view it as acceptable because of historic injustice or restorative justice, then crime will never be punished and show up in the statistics. Number 4. If police officers know that they are unable to do their jobs because they might face backlash from the public who will then burn down the entire city, like what happened in many cases during 2020 and 2021, or the laws no longer classify crime as being a crime, or if the district attorney will let out the criminal within hours with no punishment, then police officers themselves will not make arrests and prevent crimes. Police officers will not risk their lives and safety making arrests of dangerous individuals if nothing will actually happen, or if otherwise police officers cannot actually enforce everyday petty crimes such as theft. Number 5. Everyday petty crime is likely underreported, and in the case of Daniel Penny, the person who protects the innocent will likely themselves be prosecuted for protecting others. When deranged individuals assault and threaten people on the streets and in the subway, often this is not seen as criminal behavior by the states it happens in, and is therefore not reported in crime statistics. In summary, for all of these reasons, crime statistics for many different crimes, especially theft, are likely very underreported. Even though crime statistics may superficially appear to be flat or downtrending, that does not necessarily mean that the overall lawlessness and criminality of the entire country is down. What about police discrimination? Is America's justice system biased against certain groups of people? This claim is false and has no evidence to support it. While there are many famous cases of individuals being killed by police, in almost all of them the suspect was armed and made it much more likely that an unfortunate outcome was going to happen, and more generally suspects in those situations are extremely uncompliant with police and do not help their case, leading to police to have to treat them harshly or protect themselves from potential violence from the suspect. In 2021, only 11 unarmed black men were killed by police. This is a very small number in a nation of 400 million people. Unfortunately, the mainstream media presents this issue as though that number were countless thousands of innocents being shot by unfair police every year, but this view is false and is based on no evidence. Another keynote is that it is highly unlikely that policing is unfair and unjust. If a person is convicted of a crime, there is likely strong evidence to prove they committed that crime. It is highly unlikely there is a grand nefarious conspiracy to arbitrarily lock up certain groups of people, like some sort of dystopian police state. Likewise, almost all police officers in today's world wear body cameras, and would face harsh pushback for violating the civil rights of American citizens. There are cameras on most buildings, and all people carry around phones which record police interactions. In fact, many cities in America have governments which are almost entirely diverse. In certain cities, the mayor, police chief, and the majority of the police officers are non-white. Claims that suggest that police departments such as this, along with the fact that most encounters are on body camera, and that the justice system is arbitrarily throwing people in jail for no reason at all, is not supported by any evidence. What causes high crime rates? Is crime caused by the existence of poverty? This is a common claim, but is false. While poverty may be a correlation to high crime, it is not the causation of high crime. The key causation of high crime is culture, although of course a person in poverty is likely more tempted to steal, more than a rich person would likely steal. Firstly, fatherless homes. Fatherless homes are statistically the key driver of most criminal behavior and poor outcomes in life. Fatherless homes are higher in high school dropout rates, likelihood to live in poverty, and crime rates. This is a key cultural factor for why high crime exists. Secondly, cultural beliefs and social cohesion. Cultures that glorify criminality and drug culture are logically teaching people to glorify these criminal behaviors. Cultures that do not value these beliefs would logically have less crime. Strong cultures with strong social cohesion are easily shown to have low crime rates, despite the existence of poverty. In both the US and European nations, statistics show that crime directly correlates to cultural groups and cultural beliefs. Poverty or lack of money is not the causal factor. Explaining crime as being a result of poverty is disrespectful to victims of crime. It essentially removes all responsibility for theft and murder from criminals, and places it on countless external sources like poverty or historical injustice. This analysis does not hold up to scrutiny, because crime rates can be shown to vary among cultural groups even when holding poverty constant, because cultures vary. A common justification for crime from those in poverty is often seen as, quote-unquote, they are stealing bread to feed their family. This is extremely false. Often in crime videos and in crime statistics, the prime target of theft is stores and non-essential items, such as televisions, shoes, or fashion and cosmetic items. Whenever it comes to crimes like homicide, the primary reasons for homicide involve drug dealing and gang violence. Drugs are not essentials like food. Placing the blame of crime on those simply trying to feed their family is extremely false, and is pushed by those who want criminals to be seen as innocent victims, who then push for lenient sentencing of serious crimes. This false framing of crime as an issue of poverty removes the true causation of the issues, and attempts to cast criminals in a positive light, despite none of these claims having any evidence. We can see examples of cultural differences and crime rates by comparing Asian Americans and white Americans. There are 200 million whites, and 8% of those whites live in poverty. There are 19 million Asians, and 10% of those Asians live in poverty. Whites are 61% of the population, and Asians are 7% of the population. For 2019 murder arrests, there were 3,600 whites arrested, and only 83 Asians arrested. As a percentage of total murder arrests, which was 8,000 arrests total, that means that whites were 46% of arrests, and Asians were only 1% of arrests. This means there is a gigantic disparity in violent crime committed by whites and Asians in America, while Asians have a higher poverty rate than the whites. The Asian population commits far less serious crimes per capita, meaning on a percentage basis. Generally, Asian Americans have a strong family structure, with one of the lowest fatherless home rates in America, which has clearly led to superior outcomes in economics and crime. This is an easy example that shows that cultural factors and overall social cohesion is the primary factor. Another interesting angle about the question of poverty and crime is differentiating by gender. Men commit the vast majority of all crime, especially violent crime, whereas women are unlikely to commit crime. If poverty were the cause of human beings committing crime, we should expect the rates of crime to be uniform among men and women. Another key point about the question, does poverty cause high crime, is that it may be looking at the problem backwards. Rather, it is entirely possible that the reason the person is in poverty is because they are a convicted criminal. Logically, if a person is committing crimes, being arrested, and has a criminal record, that person will have a much harder life, firstly because they clearly have a bad moral compass and poor judgment, which will affect them negatively in life overall, but also because logically a person with a criminal record will have a harder time finding employment and will likely never be a high earner. This leads to a circular effect of more crime and more poverty. With this effect in mind, the situation can more accurately be analyzed as a person with a bad moral compass and poor judgment is more likely to commit crime, which then logically leads to more economic poverty. A person willing to commit crimes is not likely to be a hard-working, upstanding citizen who is looking to better their life and be a high earner. Therefore, the crime behavior was not caused by the poverty status of the individual, but rather their weak character led to both criminal behavior and poverty. This framing of the issue is likely accurate because it does not place the blame on the fact that poor people exist, but rather that individuals who are evil and are not afraid to lie, cheat, and steal are not going to have good economic outcomes. This is important because it places the blame on the individual, rather than trying to excuse the behavior by using the circumstances. What about homeless people? What do we do with people who live on the street because they cannot afford the home prices of modern America? The reality of the homeless problem in America is not a problem of economics, it is primarily a problem of drug abuse and criminality. While popular media frame the homeless population as someone down on their luck, such as a person you know who has temporarily lost their job and just needs some help, this is not the case. The primary cause of homelessness is hard drug abuse, criminal history, and extreme mental illness. That is why the perception that if we just passed more money in the government's budget for homelessness, like the way California spent $24 billion on homelessness, then we could solve the problem for those without a home. Or, as the point many people make, there are so many rich people with an unused second home. If only they shared the wealth, then all those empty homes could house those unhoused people. Again, the problem of homelessness is not one of economics, it is primarily of personal decisions, and cannot be solved by throwing money at the problem. In fact, it is not uncommon to hear stories of homeless people who refuse to use government resources, such as free shelter and food, because they desire to leave the homeless shelter and live on the street. What is the solution to the homeless problem? The solution is fairly straightforward, now that we have identified the true cause of the problem. Similar to criminals, these people are a danger to themselves and others, and we should most of all respect the rights of productive society to be able to walk down the streets safely with their family, without being harassed or assaulted. As always, we should focus on the rights of the productive 99% of Americans and have empathy for them more than anyone else. The solution to the homeless problem is similar to the problem of crime. These are people who are a danger to themselves and others in society, so the likely solution is to remove them from the streets, the same way we do with criminals, so they cannot harm themselves or others. In the past, places like psychiatric wards have helped keep these people safe from themselves, as well as protect the general populace. The solution is not to let lawlessness, theft, murder, and open drug abuse roam city streets freely unopposed.